Get it away from me! I'm not sitting next to that! I want it moved. They should hose the seat down after, the woman said, recoiling into the aisle with her hand over her mouth and nose, as though Obiageli carried something airborne. Whatever crawled in here off the street, put it in the back where the rest of the filth sits. I paid for a clean row, not for something that should have been sprayed at the door. It, Obiageli said, folding her jacket into the overhead bin without haste, is Dr. Nwankwo, and you'll want to lower your hand. Because if you keep breathing through it like that for another minute, you're going to make yourself dizzy. And I'd rather not have to treat you before we've even pushed back. The woman made a strangled noise and went to find a flight attendant. Obiageli sat down in Eleva, took out the report she was supposed to have finished 4 days ago, and did not think about her again. 81 minutes later, she would be on her knees in the aisle beside 11D, with her hands on a stranger's spine. And the woman who had wanted the seat hosed down would be the one holding the oxygen bottle for her. And neither of them would say a word about any of it. To understand why Obiageli Nwankwo was the only person on that aircraft who could name what was happening, you have to understand pressure, and to understand why she understood pressure. You have to understand the Niger Delta in 1988. Obiageli was 47 and had spent 19 years in hyperbaric and diving medicine, which is one of the smallest specialties in the world. There are perhaps 2,000 physicians on the planet who genuinely practice it. She was one of maybe 40 in Africa. Hyperbaric medicine is the medicine of pressure. It is what happens to a human body when the pressure around it goes up. And far more dangerously, what happens when it comes back down. She spent her working life on the second half of that sentence. Her patients were commercial divers, mostly saturation divers working the offshore fields off Angola and Nigeria and Ghana. Men who lived for 28 days at a time in a steel chamber, pressurized to the depth they were working at, who were decompressed over 4 days at the end of it, and for whom a mistake in that decompression meant a lifetime of bone necrosis, or paralysis, or death. She ran a chamber facility in Lagos. She was on call for the whole West African offshore sector. She had treated, by her own count, 311 cases of decompression sickness, which was more than almost anybody alive. She was flying from Male to Nairobi because she had spent 9 days on a Maldivian atoll teaching a course to recreational dive instructors and dive boat medics. The 3rd year she had done it on the recognition and field management of diving injuries. The course had a module she taught every year, and that every year the room half ignored, because it was the boring one, and it was about flying after diving. She was going to teach it again in about 80 minutes, to an audience of 211 people, at 36,000 feet, using a real case. Here is the physics, because the story does not work without it. And because Obiageli spent her life explaining it to people who had never once thought about it. When you breathe compressed air underwater, the pressure forces nitrogen into solution in your tissues. The deeper and longer you go, the more nitrogen dissolves. It sits there, inert, harmless, doing nothing at all, as long as the pressure stays up. When you come back to the surface, the pressure drops, and the nitrogen comes back out of solution. And if it comes out slowly, it leaves through your lungs and you never know it happened. If it comes out fast, it comes out as bubbles in your blood, in your joints, in your spinal cord. That is decompression sickness. That is the bends. Now, a commercial airliner does not pressurize its cabin to sea level. It cannot. At cruise, it maintains a cabin altitude of somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 feet, meaning the air pressure inside the tube is roughly 75% of what it was on the ground. Which means that getting on an aeroplane is, physiologically, another ascent. If you have residual nitrogen in your tissues from a dive, and you climb into an aircraft. You decompress again from sea level to 8,000 feet in 20 minutes. In a body that has not finished off-gassing. The bubbles form at altitude. This is why every dive agency on Earth publishes a surface interval, 18 hours minimum before flying after multiple dives, 12 absolute minimum after a single one. It is printed on every certification card. It is in every manual. People ignore it constantly. They ignore it because the holiday is ending and the flight is booked and the last dive was timed shallow. Really times, and they feel completely fine. They do feel completely fine. That is the entire trap. The nitrogen is silent at sea level. It stops being silent at 8,000 feet. Let me tell you who was on this aircraft. The woman in 11B, the one who had wanted the row host, was named Ilse Brenner, 53, Austrian, who had spent 11 days in an overwater villa and who had a specific relationship with contamination that had a clinical name she had never been given. She would spend the first hour of the flight demanding a seat change she did not get. And she would spend the second hour on her knees in an aisle holding an oxygen bottle steady. And the distance between those 2 hours would be the shortest journey anybody made that night. In Elf D, across the aisle, there was a man named Jera Okonjo Bell, 26, Kenyan Australian, who had done 4 dives in 2 days, including 1 to 41 meters on the morning of the flight, who had a fresh advanced certification card in his wallet, who had felt absolutely fine at the airport, and who was going to be paralyzed from the waist down within 90 minutes unless somebody intervened. There was his girlfriend, Petra, 24, in Elf, who had done the same dives and who would develop a much milder version of the same thing, and who would spend the flight being terrified, competent, and useful in roughly equal measure. There was a flight attendant named Wanjiku, 37, Kenyan, 16 years with the carrier. Who would make the decision that mattered? There was a retired anesthetist named Dr. Michael Traoré, 68, Malian French, in 14F, who knew a great deal of medicine and almost nothing about diving, and who would be professionally humble in a way that saved several hours. There was a man in 9C named Bastian Cole, 44, a dive boat operator from the same atoll, who had sold Jera the 4-dive package and who had told him, when asked about flying, that 18 hours was very conservative and that everyone does 12. It's fine. He was on the same flight. He had done 2 dives himself that morning. And there was the aircraft's cabin pressurization system, which had been running with a drifting outflow valve for 11 days, which had been logged twice as an intermittent fault and deferred twice under the minimum equipment list, and which was that night maintaining a cabin altitude of 9,400 feet, instead of the 7,200 it was set for. 2,200 extra feet. Nobody on board would have noticed. The difference is imperceptible. Ears do not pop differently. Nothing feels wrong. Unless you have nitrogen in your tissues, in which case the difference is everything. Obiageli noticed the cabin altitude before she noticed the patient, which is unusual and which she attributes entirely to boredom. She had been reading her report for 40 minutes. She had put it down. She had, out of habit, a genuine professional tic that her colleagues teased her about, flicked the seatback screen to the flight information page. Because on this carrier, the flight information page displayed cabin altitude. And because she had been looking at cabin altitude readouts on aircraft for 19 years, the way a cardiologist looks at other people's ankles, 9,400. She sat up. It was not dangerous. It was within certified limits. The regulatory ceiling is 8,000 feet in normal operation, but aircraft are permitted excursions, and 9.4 was not an emergency by any standard. It was, however, wrong. It was 1,100 feet above the maximum normal and 2,200 above what this aircraft type typically ran. And the physiological difference between 7,200 feet and 9,400 feet. For a person with a saturated tissue compartment, is the difference between a bubble that stays subclinical and a bubble that grows, she thought. Someone on this aircraft dived this week and is having a bad night. It was a completely idle thought. It was the thought of a specialist noticing a number. She had it, and she let it go, and she picked her report back up. 9 minutes later, she heard the man in 11D say to the woman beside him, in a low, confused voice, "My legs feel weird." Obiageli put the report down and did not pick it up again for 4 hours. She looked across the aisle. Jera Okonjo-Bell was 26 and sunburnt, and had the specific physical build of somebody who had spent the last fortnight in the sea. He was shifting in his seat. Repeatedly. In the restless way of a person trying to find a position that fixes a sensation. "Weird how?" Petra said. "Like pins and needles. Both of them. And kind of heavy?" Obiageli was out of her seat. "Sir," she said, "I'm a doctor. Have you been diving?" He looked up at her. And the look on his face was the look she had seen 311 times, the specific dawning of a person who has just been asked a question that connects two things they had not connected. "Yeah," he said. "This morning." "How deep?" 41 meters. "How long ago did you surface?" He looked at his watch. "About 7 hours?" "How many dives in the last 48 hours?" 4. "Any decompression stops?" "On the deep one?" "Yeah. We did. There was a 3-minute at 5 meters. And, sir," Obiageli said, "I want you to listen to me very carefully, and I want you to not be frightened by how fast I am about to move. My name is Dr. Obiageli Nwankwo. I am a hyperbaric physician. That means I treat exactly one thing, and this is it. You have decompression sickness. The nitrogen you took on this morning is coming out of solution as bubbles because the cabin is at 9,400 feet. I need you flat. I need you on high-flow oxygen. And I need this aircraft on the ground, and you in a recompression chamber as fast as physically possible." Jera stared at her. "I feel fine," he said. "Apart from my legs." "Yes," Obiageli said. "That is what they all say." "Petra." "Is it? Stand up and let me get him flat." Here is why she moved so fast. And it is the single most important clinical fact in this story. Decompression sickness comes in 2 broad flavors. Type I is joint pain, the classic bends. Agonizing, frightening, and almost never permanently damaging. Type 2 involves the central nervous system, bubbles in the spinal cord. Type 2, with lower limb symptoms, bilateral paresthesia, and weakness, is spinal DCS. And spinal DCS has a treatment window measured in hours. And the outcome curve is brutal and steep, treated inside 6 hours. Most people walk out, treated after 12. A meaningful proportion never walk again. He was 7 hours from surfacing and about 90 minutes into symptom onset. And every additional minute at 9,400 feet was actively growing the bubbles that were compressing his spinal cord. She had, at the absolute outside, 4 hours. They were 5 hours and 40 minutes from Nairobi. Wanjiku arrived in 11 seconds. "Ma'am, I need you to listen," Obiageli said. And there was something in the voice, the specific, flat urgency of a physician who has done this before and is not going to spend any of the next 4 hours on preamble that stopped the sentence. "Dr. Nwankwo, hyperbaric medicine. 19 years. This man has spinal decompression sickness. I need 4 things, and I need them in this order. 1. All the oxygen on this aircraft. Not the drop-down masks. Those are diluted and they won't do. I need the therapeutic bottles from the medical kits. Every one you have. With the highest flow mask you carry. 2. I need him flat on the floor. Not reclined. Flat. Supine. In the aisle or the galley. 3. I need the captain to descend this aircraft as low as fuel and terrain permit. Immediately. And to tell me what the cabin altitude is doing. Every 1,000 feet of cabin altitude we lose shrinks the bubbles in this man's spinal cord. This is not comfort. This is treatment. 4. I need the nearest airport with a functioning recompression chamber. And it is almost certainly not Nairobi. Wanjiku looked at her for 1.5 seconds. Sit tight, she said, and went. Obiageli thought. Afterward, that a great deal had turned on 1.5 seconds. They got him flat in the aft galley in 4 minutes. On a bed of blankets, with Petra's rolled jacket under his head and nothing under his legs. Because in spinal DCS, you do not elevate the legs. Contrary to what almost every first aid manual said for 40 years. They got oxygen on him at 15 liters per minute through a non-rebreather mask, which was the single most important intervention available at altitude, and which Obiageli would have traded almost anything for a second bottle of. Oxygen works in DCS for a reason that is elegant and worth stating. Breathing pure oxygen creates a steep nitrogen gradient between the tissue and the lung, which accelerates the elimination of the dissolved nitrogen, which shrinks the bubbles. It is not a comfort measure. It is the only actual treatment available outside a chamber, and every minute of it counts. Michael Traoré arrived at minute 6, having been fetched by a flight attendant, and did the thing that made Obiageli respect him immediately. He crouched, looked, and said, I'm an anesthetist. I know nothing about diving medicine. Tell me what you want. I want a second pair of hands and a neuro exam every 15 minutes. Obiageli said. Power. Sensation. Reflexes. Bladder. Document all of it with times. The trajectory is what will tell us how fast this is moving, and the chamber team will need it. Bladder? Urinary retention is the sign that will tell us he is in serious trouble. Spinal cord DCS goes for the bladder early, and people do not report it because they are 26 and embarrassed. She raised her voice slightly, without looking up. Jara, I am going to ask you an undignified question every 15 minutes, and I want an honest answer every single time. Do you feel like you need to urinate? No? Do you feel anything at all down there? A pause. A longer one than she wanted. I don't know, he said, in a much smaller voice. I can't really tell. Thank you for being honest, Obiageli said. That is exactly what I needed to know. She looked at Traoré across the body. He had understood. Captain Aisha Mwangi. 51. Kenyan. 23 years with the carrier. Took the report from Wanjiku and made 3 decisions in under 4 minutes. She descended to flight level 240, which brought the cabin altitude down to just under 6,000 feet. She then, after a conversation with Obiageli, conducted over the interphone in the specific compressed language of 2 professionals with no time, descended further to flight level 180, which brought the cabin to roughly 4,300 feet and burned fuel at a rate that would ordinarily have been unthinkable. And she diverted to Mahe, in the Seychelles, not Nairobi, not Mogadishu. Mahe, 2 hours and 10 minutes away, with a hospital, and, crucially, with a recompression chamber. Because the Seychelles is a diving destination, and diving destinations have chambers. Obiageli had asked for the chamber, and Wanjiku had asked operations, and operations had come back with 3 options, and Obiageli had chosen in 6 seconds. Mahe, she said. Their chamber is at Victoria. It's a multi-place, and they have a duty team. I've referred patients there twice. You know their chamber? I know most of the chambers in the Indian Ocean, Obiageli said. It's a very small specialty. Cabin altitude, 4,300 feet. Oxygen at 15 liters. 2 hours and 10 minutes to Mahe. Obiageli sat on the galley floor with her hand on Jera Okonjo-Bell's ankle, checking a pulse she could have found blindfolded, and did the arithmetic she had done 311 times. 7 hours from surfacing. 90 minutes of symptoms. 2 hours to Mahe. 30 minutes to hospital. 30 to 40 minutes to chamber pressurization. 11.5 to 12 hours from surface to chamber. The literature was not kind about 12 hours. The literature was, in fact, specifically brutal about 12 hours. She did not say any of this to him. What she said was, the oxygen is working. Your left foot has better sensation than it did 15 minutes ago. We are going to a chamber, and the chamber is the treatment, and everything we are doing right now is buying you a better outcome in that chamber. Keep breathing this mask. Do not take it off to talk to me. Blink twice for yes. He blinked twice. The flashback came to her on the galley floor. Uninvited. At the 90-minute mark, in the way the important ones do. Port Harcourt. 1988. She was 10 years old. Her father was a commercial diver. Not saturation that came later to the Delta, but surface-supplied air. Working the shallow fields and the pipeline inspections, in a brass and canvas world that had already been obsolete for a decade everywhere else, and that persisted there because the equipment was what there was. She had grown up around divers. She had grown up around the specific culture of them, the noise, the profanity, the enormous meals, the absolute seriousness underneath all of it, about tables and times and stops. Her father had a laminated card in his shirt pocket. Always. With the decompression tables printed on it. He had shown it to her when she was 6. This card, he had told her, is the difference between me coming home and me not coming home. Not my strength. Not my luck. This card, and doing exactly what it says. He had never once cut a stop. She had asked him, at 9, whether he ever did, and he had looked at her with genuine incomprehension and said, why would I do that? In 1988, a diver on his crew named Sonny had cut a stop. He had been on a job that ran long, and the boat had wanted to get in before dark. And he had come up from 33 meters missing, 11 minutes of his final stop. He had been fine on the boat. He had been fine on the drive back. He had started to feel odd at about the 2-hour mark and had told nobody. Because he was 31, and it was probably nothing. At 4 hours, he could not stand up. There was one chamber in the whole of the Eastern Delta at that time, and it was down for maintenance. Sonny had been driven 11 hours to Lagos in the back of a Peugeot. Obiageli had been 10 years old and had watched her father come home from that drive at 4 in the morning and sit down on the step outside their house and put his head in his hands. And she had asked him what happened. And he had said the sentence she built a career on, he'll live. He won't walk. And every single hour we spent getting there took something off him that he doesn't get back. Every hour takes something off him that he doesn't get back. She had gone to medical school with that sentence in her head. She had chosen the smallest, least glamorous, most technically obscure specialty in medicine with that sentence in her head. She had spent 19 years running a chamber in Lagos, so that no man on a rig off the Nigerian coast would ever again be driven 11 hours in the back of a car. She sat on the floor of an aircraft galley over the Indian Ocean with her hand on a 26-year-old's ankle and thought, every hour takes something off him. And then she thought, so Take the hours off the other end. And she got up and went to the interphone. Captain, she said, 2 things. First, I need the Mahe chamber team activated now. Not on arrival. If they start their pre-dive checks and get the chamber pressurized and warm before we land, we take 30 minutes off. That is 30 minutes of his spinal cord. Second, and I need you to hear this as a clinical request and not an operational one. When we land, I want to go directly from aircraft to ambulance to chamber. No terminal. No immigration. He does not walk. He does not sit up. He goes on a stretcher, on his back, with the oxygen still running. Every position change and every minute vertical is a risk. Can that be arranged? There was a pause on the interphone. Doctor, Captain Mwangi said, I have been flying into Mahe for 19 years. Give me 8 minutes. She got it in 6. The other thing that happened during those 2 hours, and which Onyuguli did not have time to think about until much later, was Petra. Petra Lindgren was 24 and had done the same 4 dives, including the 41-meter one. And at the 50-minute mark, she said, in a very controlled voice, to Michael Traoré, excuse me, my elbow hurts. Traoré looked at Obiageli. Which elbow? Obiageli said, without moving from the ankle. Right. It started about 10 minutes ago. It's not a normal act. I've been trying to decide if I'm imagining it. Can you make it worse by moving it? No. It's just there. Deep? Like it's in the joint rather than the muscle? Yes. Exactly that. You have type 1 decompression sickness? Obiageli said. Michael, put her on the second bottle at 15 liters and sit her down. Petra, listen to me. You are not in danger the way he is. Yours is joint bends, and it responds beautifully to oxygen, and it is very unlikely to cause you any lasting problem. You are also going in the chamber with him because you are going to be in Mahe anyway, and the treatment is the same, and there is absolutely no reason for you to spend the next month with a sore elbow when a chamber will fix it in 3 hours. Petra started crying then. For the first time, it's my fault, she said. I looked it up. On the boat, I looked up flying after diving and it said 18 hours, and I said to Jera, and Bastian said everyone does 12. Obiageli said. Petra stared at her. How did you? Because Bastian is standing 9 rows forward, pretending not to listen. Obiageli said, without raising her voice and without looking up. And because I have been having this exact conversation for 19 years, and because there is a Bastian on every dive boat in the world. 9 rows forward. Bastian Cole sat very still. She dealt with him in the terminal at Mahe. 4 hours later. In 90 seconds. And it was the only 90 seconds of the entire night in which her voice was not flat. You sold him a 4-dive package with a 41-meter dive on the morning of a flight, she said. He asked me about... You told him 18 hours was conservative, and everyone does 12. He is in a chamber right now. He has a 50% chance of walking normally in a year. That is what you sold him. Bastian Cole's face was gray. Everyone does, he started. Everyone does. Obiageli agreed. That is precisely the sentence. Everyone does it, and almost everyone is fine. And you have been running that boat for how long? 9 years? 11? And you have watched several hundred people fly at 12 hours and be fine? And every single one of those has taught you that the 18-hour rule is bureaucratic nonsense. I want to tell you what you have actually been doing. You have been running a lottery on other people's spinal cords and pocketing the ticket price. And the fact that you have not seen the losing ticket until tonight does not mean you were not selling them. It means you were lucky. You have been lucky for 11 years, and tonight you were not. And the person who paid for it was a 26-year-old with a fresh, advanced card who trusted the man with the boat. You did 2 dives yourself this morning and got on this flight. So you also bought a ticket. You just haven't found out yet whether it won. She watched that land. Go to the hospital. She said, not because I care what happens to you. Because you have residual nitrogen and symptoms can present up to 24 hours. And if you stroke out in a hotel room tonight, the paperwork will be somebody else's problem, and they don't deserve it. She turned and walked to the ambulance. Bastian Cole went to the hospital. He was asymptomatic. He was, again, lucky. He sold the dive business 14 months later. Obiageli learned this from an instructor on the following year's course, who mentioned it as gossip, and who said that Cole had told people he had lost his nerve for it. She thought that was probably the most honest thing he had ever said about diving. Ilse Brenner held the oxygen bottle. This is the part of the story that Obiageli finds hardest to explain when she tells it. And she does tell it, because the course module needs it. At minute 40, in the aft galley, with Jera flat on the floor, and Traoré doing a neuro exam, and Wanjiku managing the cabin, and Petra weeping quietly on a jump seat. There had simply not been enough hands. The oxygen bottle needed to be held upright and steady at a specific angle to keep the mask seal and the regulator flow. And every single person present was doing something else. Ilse Brenner had appeared in the galley doorway. She had come aft, initially, to complain again about her seat. She had arrived, and seen, and stopped. Obiageli had looked up. She remembers this precisely, and had seen the woman who had told a flight attendant that the row should be hosed down, and had thought, in the specific triage brain of a doctor mid-emergency, hands are hands. You, she said. Come here! Hold this. This angle. Don't let it tip. And Ilse Brenner had crossed the galley, knelt on the floor beside a stranger's head, and held the oxygen bottle at that angle for 1 hour and 40 minutes without being relieved and without asking to be. She did not speak. Neither did Obiageli. There was nothing available to either of them that would have survived being said. At Mahe, when the paramedics took over and the bottle was handed off, Ilse Brenner stood up on legs that had gone completely numb from the knees down after 90 minutes on a galley floor. And she looked at Obiageli, and she opened her mouth. And Obiageli said, "No, not cruelly, flatly, not now." Obiageli said, "I have a patient, and you and I are not going to do this at 4 in the morning in a galley, because you need something and I don't have it to give." Ilse Brenner closed her mouth and nodded and went to find her bag. She wrote, "Eventually, a long letter. 6 weeks later, forwarded through the airline. It was not a good letter, it explained too much. It reached for absolution more than once. It used the word upbringing twice, and Obiageli read it and put it in a drawer, and did not reply for 4 months. When she did reply, it was 3 lines. Miss Brenner, you held the bottle for 100 minutes, and you did not ask to be relieved. That is the only part of that night that is yours to keep. I would suggest you keep it and let the rest go, since nothing you do with the rest of it will change what you said. And something you do with the bottle might change what you say next time. Yours. Oh, Nwankwo." Jera Okonjo Bell went into the multiplace chamber at Victoria Hospital. Mahe. 11 hours and 40 minutes after surfacing from a 41-meter dive. He was given a U.S. Navy treatment table 6, the standard for neurological decompression sickness, which runs 4 hours and 45 minutes and pressurizes the patient to the equivalent of 18 meters of seawater, while they breathe pure oxygen in cycles. He had 2 extensions, which is common, and the whole thing ran 6.5 hours. He came out with sensation, returned to both legs. Power, at 4 out of 5 on the left and 3 out of 5 on the right. And no bladder function. He had 4 further treatments over the following 6 days. He walked out of Victoria Hospital 9 days after he walked onto that aircraft. With a stick. With a catheter. With an appointment in Nairobi. And with the specific, unfocused expression of a 26-year-old who has had his entire sense of his own body rewritten in a fortnight. 14 months later, he walked without the stick. The catheter went at 7 months. He does not talk about that period. He has residual numbness in the right foot, and he will have it for life. And he has a specific weakness in dorsiflexion that means he cannot run properly. And he was a person who ran. He does not dive. He has not been in the sea since. He wrote to Obiageli on the 1st anniversary. And the letter said, "In part, I have read everything about this. Everything. I know now that at 11 hours, 40, the outcome curve is basically a cliff, and that I came out on the good side of a coin flip. I know that oxygen at altitude and dropping the cabin to 4,000 feet is why I am typing this standing up at a desk instead of from a chair. What I keep getting stuck on is that you were on that flight. In the whole world, there are maybe 40 people on my continent who do what you do, and one of them was sitting across the aisle from me, reading a report on the one flight I ever took where it mattered. I do not know what to do with that. It feels like winning something I did not earn. I have decided to treat it as a debt. I do not know yet what I am paying it to. I will work it out." Obiageli wrote back, "Jera. Do not treat it as a debt, and do not treat it as luck. And this is not a comforting distinction. It is a factual one. I was on that flight because I teach a course in Malay every year to dive professionals about exactly the injury you sustained. I have taught it 3 years running. Roughly 90 instructors have sat through the flying after diving module, and about 40 of them have told me afterwards that it was the boring one. I was on that aircraft because a small number of people decided, over about 60 years, that diving medicine should exist as a specialty. Because a chamber was built at Victoria in 1998 by people who thought a diving destination should have one. Because a captain descended to 18,000 feet and burned fuel, she will have written a report about. Because a flight attendant with 16 years made a decision in 1.5 seconds instead of asking her supervisor. Because an anesthetist who knew nothing about diving said, "Tell me what you want," instead of pretending. None of that is luck. All of it is people doing unglamorous work for years in advance of a night that had not happened yet. If you want to pay something, pay it into that. Be one of the people doing the unglamorous thing in advance. That is the only currency this actually runs on. I, Nwankwo, Jera Okonjo-Bell is now, at 32, a dive safety officer for a research institute in Mombasa. He does not dive. He runs the tables, the gas planning, the emergency protocols, and the chamber liaison for teams of scientists who do. He is, by every account, extremely rigid about surface intervals before flying, and has been known to cancel people's flights. The aircraft's outflow valve was replaced at Mahé. The maintenance investigation found the intermittent fault had been logged on 2 previous occasions and deferred both times under a provision that permitted deferral because the system remained within certified limits. It had remained within certified limits. 9,400 feet is legal. The airline's engineering review concluded, correctly, that no regulation had been breached. It also concluded, and this was Obiageli's contribution, that the certified limit had been written to protect a general population, and that a cabin altitude of 9,400 feet has a materially different meaning for a passenger with residual tissue nitrogen than for anybody else, and that a drifting pressurization system is therefore not a purely operational matter on routes serving diving destinations. She submitted a 6-page technical annex to their review. She was not asked to. She sent it anyway. Because she had been sending unsolicited technical annexes to organizations for 19 years, and roughly 1 in 5 got read. This one got read. The airline now flags pressurization deferrals differently on 11 routes, serving major diving destinations, and prioritizes rectification rather than deferral on those routes. 11 routes. It is a very small change. Obiageli considers it the most useful thing she has ever written. Wanjiku, the flight attendant, was given a commendation. She was also, at her own request, seconded for 4 months to help build a training module. And the module is called Times Diving Emergencies at Altitude, and it is now taught to that carrier's cabin crew on every route serving the Maldives, Seychelles, Mauritius, Zanzibar, Sharm el-Sheikh, and the Red Sea coast. It teaches 3 things. It teaches that any passenger reporting new numbness, weakness, joint pain, or unusual fatigue on a flight departing a diving destination should be asked one question. Times have you been diving in the last 24 hours? Times before anything else. It teaches that the answer changes everything. And it teaches that the correct response to a suspected diving injury is high-flow oxygen, supine positioning, and immediate notification of the flight deck. Because the flight deck can change the cabin altitude, and the cabin altitude is the treatment. Wanjiku opens the module the same way every time. She says, "There is one question. It takes 4 seconds to ask. In 16 years I have asked it once. And the reason I knew to ask it is that a doctor happened to be sitting in 11A. You are not going to have a doctor in 11A. You are going to have the question." Obiageli flew home to Lagos 11 days later, after Jera's 4th treatment, because she had rearranged everything and stayed. She sat in 14A and flicked the seatback screen to the flight information page and looked at the cabin altitude, which was 7,100 feet. Which was correct. She looked at it for a while. She thought about her father, dead now 9 years, who had carried a laminated card in his shirt pocket for 31 years and had never once cut a stop, and who had sat on a step in Port Harcourt in 1988 at 4 in the morning and taught his 10-year-old daughter the sentence that made her, "Every hour takes something off him that he doesn't get back." She had spent 19 years taking hours off the other end. 9,400 to 4,300. That was hours. Chamber team activated before landing. That was 30 minutes. Aircraft to ambulance to chamber with no terminal. That was 40. Wanjiku's 1.5 seconds. Traore's 4 words. Captain Wangi's 6 minutes. Add them up, and it came to somewhere between 2.5 and 3 hours. Jera Okonjo-Bell walked out of Victoria Hospital. At 11:40 from surface, he was on the good side of a cliff. At 14 hours, he would not have been. She had spent a career learning that the difference between the 2 outcomes is never one dramatic intervention. It is always 11 small people doing 11 unglamorous things faster than they strictly had to. That is the whole of it. That is the entire content of 19 years. The seat next to her was empty. Nobody had asked to be moved. She closed the screen and slept the whole way home. The 2 hours between Mahe being chosen and Mahe being reached were the longest working hours of Obiageli Nwankwo's professional life. And almost nothing happened in them. And that was the point. There was no more treatment available. That was the brutal shape of it. She had oxygen, and she had positioning, and she had cabin altitude, and she had deployed all 3 inside 11 minutes. And after that, there was nothing left in the aircraft that could alter the trajectory of the bubbles in Jera Okonjo-Bell's spinal cord. Everything after Minute 11 was monitoring and company. She had spent 19 years learning that monitoring and company were not the lesser part of the job. And she had spent most of those 19 years failing to convince other physicians of it. So they monitored. Every 15 minutes. Michael Traore ran the exam and called the findings, and Obiageli wrote them on the back of her conference program. Because there was no chart, and the chamber team at Victoria would need a trajectory, and nobody's memory is good enough after a night like that. The entries. Transcribed later into the formal record. Read in part. 2140 bilateral. LLE from anesthesia. Power L 4 plus 5. Fire. Fem. Sensation reduced below mid-shin. Bilaterally. R. L. No saddle. Bladder. Sensation present. Urge absent. Alert. Oriented. Frightened. 2155. Power L. 4 plus. 5. Très plus fem. Sensation now reduced to mid-thigh R. Saddle sensation reduced. Bladder. No urge. No sensation of fullness. Cabin altitude. 4,300 feet. O215L. Min NRB. Compliant. Mask seal. Good. 2,210 R. 3 plus. 5 unchanged. L. Unchanged. Saddle unchanged. First time not deteriorating. 2,225 unchanged. Possible improvement. L foot dorsiflexion. Patient reports less like static. 2,240 L foot dorsiflexion improved to 5/5. R. Unchanged. 3 plus. Saddle unchanged. Sensation returning to L mid shin. That entry 2,240 was the one that mattered. And Obiageli had to make herself write it neutrally instead of writing what she felt. Which was the specific, enormous release of a clinician watching a curve flatten. The oxygen was working. The reduced cabin altitude was working. He had stopped getting worse. He's plateaued, Traore said quietly. At the 2,240 exam. Yes. That's the oxygen. That's the oxygen and 4,300 feet. Obiageli said. Mostly the 4,000. 300. I want to understand that properly. Traore said. Explain it to me like I know nothing. Because I know nothing. So she explained it to him. On the galley floor. While a 26-year-old lay between them, breathing pure oxygen through a mask. Boyle's law. She said. A bubble's volume is inversely proportional to the pressure around it. At 9,400 feet, the ambient pressure is about 71% of sea level. At 4,300 feet, it's about 86%. That difference, 71 to 86, shrinks every gas bubble in his body by roughly 17%. By volume, instantly. The moment the pressure comes up, 17%. In accord. Is the difference between a bubble that occludes a vessel and one that doesn't. It is the difference between compression that damages and compression that irritates. Traore absorbed this. So, the aeroplane is the treatment, he said. The aeroplane is a chamber that runs the wrong direction. Obiageli said. And tonight we ran it the right direction, as far as it would go. That's what a descent is. It's a very shallow recompression. Traore looked at the mask, and at the young man's face, and at the notes on the back of a conference program. I have been an anesthetist for 40 years, he said. I have given probably 11,000 anesthetics. I did not know any of that. There's no reason you should, Obiageli said. It's a specialty of 40 people on this continent. It exists because commercial diving exists, and commercial diving kills people. And it stayed small because nobody's cousin gets the bends. She adjusted the flow meter fractionally. It is the least fashionable thing in medicine, and I have loved it for 19 years. At 2,255, Jera spoke through the mask, which she had told him not to do, and she let it go because of what he said. Am I going to walk? Obiageli sat back on her heels. This was, in her professional taxonomy, the hardest question in her specialty, and she had been asked it 311 times. And there was a right way to answer it, and it was not a comfortable way. I don't know, she said. Anybody who tells you they know is lying to you, and I am not going to do that. Here is what I do know, and I'm going to give you all of it. You are 7.5 hours from surfacing with spinal decompression sickness. That is late. I would like it to be 4 hours. It is not 4 hours. You are also, in the last 40 minutes, not getting worse. Your left foot has improved. That is a good sign, and it is a real one. You are going to a chamber that I know, staffed by a team I have referred patients to, and you are going to be pressurized on a table 6 within about 90 minutes of landing, which is fast. What I will not tell you is a percentage, because the percentage in the literature is for a population, and you are not a population. What I will tell you is that the 4 things that most affect your outcome are how early you get oxygen, how early you get recompressed, how much of the cord is involved, and your age. You got oxygen inside 2 hours of symptom onset. You will be recompressed inside 12 hours. The cord involvement is incomplete and improving. And you are 26. 3 of those 4 are as good as they could realistically be given the start. That is everything I have, and it is the truth. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, muffled, "Thanks for not lying." "You're welcome." Petra's crying. "Yes." "Is she?" "She has joint bends." Obiageli said, "She is fine. She is crying because she is 24 and her boyfriend is on a galley floor, and she looked it up on the boat and got overruled by a man with a business. She will be in the chamber next to you tomorrow, and she will be entirely well, and she will spend a long time feeling responsible for something that is not hers." "It's not her fault." "No," Obiageli said. "It is not. Tell her that yourself. In the chamber. In a few hours. When you can. It'll count for more from you than from me." He did. 19 hours later. In a multi-place chamber at 18 meters of simulated depth, with both of them breathing oxygen through built-in masks and unable to speak properly. He wrote it on a whiteboard and turned it around. Petra Lindgren has photographed that whiteboard and still has the photograph. Captain Aisha Mwangi flew the last 2 hours at flight level 180, which is not where wide-body aircraft fly, and burned an amount of fuel that generated a 4-page report and a meeting. She defended it in 11 words at the meeting and then declined to elaborate. "The physician told me the cabin altitude was the treatment," she said. "I gave her the lowest cabin altitude the aircraft could sustain to a suitable airfield with a chamber. Everything else was arithmetic." The airline's flight operations director asked whether she would do it again. "I would do it faster," Captain Mwangi said. She had, at the time of the diversion, 211 other passengers on board, and a schedule, and a crew duty limit, and an alternate that was not on anybody's plan. She had also had, on hair in her phone, a woman who had said the sentence, times, "This is not comfort. This is treatment," in a voice that she had recognized as the voice of somebody who knew precisely what they were asking for, and precisely what it cost. There is a specific tone. Captain Wangi told a room of trainee captains 3 years later, in a session on diversion decision-making. You will hear it perhaps 5 times in a career. It is the sound of an expert who has stopped hedging. When you hear it, the correct response is not to interrogate it. The correct response is to ask what they need and then find out how fast you can give it to them. I have been wrong about many things in 23 years. I have never once been wrong to move fast on that tone. There is a flashback that belongs in the middle of this, and it is not from 1988. It is from 9 days earlier. In a training room above a dive shop on an atoll in the Maldives, with a ceiling fan and 11 dive instructors, and Obiageli Nwankwo standing at a whiteboard. She was teaching the flying after diving module. 3rd year running. The one everybody sat through. She had put up the standard slide 18 hours after multiple dives. 12. After a single no decompression dive. 24. After any dive requiring decompression stops, and she had watched the room's attention slide off it the way it always did. And then she had done the thing she had started doing in year 2. Because the slide alone did not work. She had put down the pen and said, "Right. Hands up, who has flown inside 12 hours. 4 hands. Then, slowly, 3 more. Hands up, who has told a client that 18 hours is conservative. 6 hands. More reluctantly. Hands up, who has ever had a client get bent on a flight. No hands. Correct, Obiageli said. And that is exactly the problem. And I want to spend the next 20 minutes on why. You have all, collectively, put several thousand people on aeroplanes inside the guideline. None of you has ever seen one go wrong. So every single day of your professional experience has taught you that the guideline is padded. Here is what your experience cannot teach you. The event you are gambling on is rare. It is perhaps 1 in a few thousand. Which means you can run this bet for a decade on a busy boat and never see it. And when it does come in, it does not come in as a headache. It comes in as a 26-year-old who cannot feel his legs at 36,000 feet. 6 hours from a chamber, and there is no version of that where you get to say sorry and fix it. You are not making a decision about whether the rule is padded. You are making a decision about whether you are prepared to be the person who sold the losing ticket. That is the module. That is all of it. Are there questions? There had been 2 questions. One of them had been good. 9 days later, she had knelt on a galley floor with the losing ticket in front of her. She has taught the module every year since. And she now teaches it with the case. With Jera's permission. And with his letter. And with a photograph of a whiteboard in a chamber that says times it is not your fault. The module is no longer the boring one. Attendance at that course has tripled. She finds this both gratifying and unbearable. In roughly equal measure. And has said so publicly. It should not have required a real spinal cord, she said, at a diving medicine conference in Durban. The physics was always the same. The tables were always the same. Nothing about the science changed on that flight. What changed is that I can now put a face on the slide, and it turns out that 11 years of correct physics is worth less to a room of instructors than 1 photograph of a young man with a walking stick. I have made my peace with that. I use the photograph. He offered it, and I use it. And it works. And every year I use it, I am aware that the reason it works is that we as a species are extremely bad at responding to numbers and extremely good at responding to a face. If that is the tool, I will use the tool. Michael Traoré, the anesthetist, retired properly the following year. Having been semi-retired for 3, he wrote to Obiageli twice. The first letter. 3 weeks after Mahe said, Doctor, I want to record something for you because I do not think you noticed it and I think you should have it. When I arrived at that galley, I was 68 years old and had been practicing for 40 years, and I did not know what was wrong with that young man. I had a differential in my head, and it was wrong. I was thinking about a spinal stroke, and I was preparing to say so. I did not say so. And the reason I did not is that you were already on the floor with your hands on him, and you had already said the word decompression, and you had said it in a tone that I recognized. I have spent 40 years in operating theaters. I know the difference between a colleague who is thinking and a colleague who is remembering. You were remembering. You had seen this precise thing before. Many times. And I had never seen it once. The most useful thing I did that night was to say 4 words and then shut up. 40 years of training in order to shut up at the right moment. I want you to know that I understood at the time that this is what I was doing, and that it was the right thing, and that I was not humoring you. M. Traoré. The second letter, 14 months later, was 2 lines. Doctor, I am told the young man is walking. I have thought about him most days. Thank you for letting an old anesthetist hold the torch. Obiageli kept both. She has. In her office in Lagos. A shallow drawer that holds perhaps 9 things from 19 years. Traoré's 2 letters are in it. So is Jairus. So is a laminated decompression table card, cracked across one corner, that came out of her father's shirt pocket in 2016. She does not open the drawer often. She knows exactly what is in it. Petra Lindgren was treated on a table 5, the shorter table, for type 1 and was symptom-free at the end of it, and was discharged the following morning, and spent 9 days in a hotel in Mahe visiting a hospital. She was 24 and had never dealt with anything remotely like it. She dealt with it, in Obiageli's assessment, extremely well and at considerable cost. At some point on the 4th day, she asked Obiageli, in a hospital corridor, why didn't he listen to me? I found the 18 hours. I showed him, and then Bastien said 1 sentence, and that was it. Obiageli thought about how to answer this honestly. Because you were a 24-year-old girlfriend reading a website, she said, and Bastien was a 44-year-old man with a boat and 11 years of doing it. And in almost every room, that trade goes the way it went. You were correct, and you were overruled by confidence. I want you to hear something, because you are going to be in this situation again in some other form for the rest of your life. Being correct is not the same as being persuasive, and the gap between them is where a very large amount of harm lies. You were right. You lost the argument. Those are 2 separate facts, and only one of them is about you. Petra was quiet. How do you win the argument? She said. Sometimes you don't. Obiageli said. Sometimes the man has the boat. She paused. What you can do is be specific. Do not say, the website says 18 hours. Say, if we fly at 12 and you get bent, the nearest chamber is at Victoria in the Seychelles, and it will take us 6 hours to get there. And the outcome curve for spinal DCS at 12 hours is bad. Specific frightens people. General does not. That is the only reliable tool I have ever found, and it works perhaps half the time. Petra Lindgren became a dive instructor. This surprised absolutely everybody, including her. She teaches in Sweden and Norway. Cold water. Technical. And she is known in a very small community for being extremely rigid about surface intervals, and for a particular briefing she gives about flying, that is. By all accounts, upsetting and effective. She and Jera are not together. They separated 11 months after Mahe. without acrimony. In the way of two people who went through something at 24 and 26 and could not subsequently work out how to be ordinary with each other. They are in contact. They speak on the anniversary. Obiageli's father was called Emeka Nwankwo, and he dived commercially for 31 years and died in 2016 of a lung cancer that had nothing to do with any of it. He never had decompression sickness. Not once. In 31 years. In an era and a place where it was common. She asked him about it when she was in medical school and full of the specific arrogance of a person who has just learned that most human behavior is statistically explicable. Dad. 31 years without a hit. That's not just the tables. That's luck as well. And her father had said she wrote it down that night. And she has the note. It is not luck. Some men on my cruise were unlucky. All of them cut something first. Every hit I ever saw came after somebody was in a hurry. The boat was in a hurry. Or the company was in a hurry. Or the man was in a hurry to get home. Nobody ever got bent while doing exactly what the card said. The card is slow. That is what it is for. It is a slow thing in a world that is in a hurry. And my whole job for 31 years was to be the slow thing. My whole job was to be the slow thing. She has that on the wall of her office in Lagos, in her father's handwriting, from a birthday card he sent her in 2009, in which he wrote it again because she had asked him to. It is, she says, the entire philosophy of preventive medicine expressed by a man with no formal education past 16. She thought about it on the galley floor over the Indian Ocean. Everybody in that story who caused harm was in a hurry. The boat was in a hurry to sell 4 dives. Bastian was in a hurry to close the sale. Jarrah was in a hurry to get his advanced card. The maintenance deferral was made by an organization in a hurry to dispatch an aircraft. And everybody who reduced harm was, in the specific technical sense, slow. Obiageli did not run to Elavi. She asked 5 questions first. In order. And the order mattered. Traoré did not offer his differential. He waited. Wanjiku did not escalate through her supervisor, but she also did not act before she had heard the whole request. She stood there for 1.5 seconds and let the doctor finish the list of 4 things. Captain Wangi did not descend immediately on hearing medical emergency. She got the physician on the interphone and asked what the descent was for. Every single one of them took the extra beat. That is what the extra beat is worth. 19 days after Mahe. Obiageli Nwankwo was back in Lagos. On call for the chamber. At 2 a.m, taking a referral from a rig 80 nautical miles offshore. A saturation diver. 38. With joint pain in a shoulder after a routine decompression that had run to schedule. Probably nothing. Possibly something. She took the call. Gave the advice. Arranged the flight. And had the chamber warm and ready before the helicopter lifted. The man was treated on a table 6. Went back to work in 9 days. Nobody wrote a letter about it. Nobody made a training module. There was no diversion. No Isla. No 26-year-old. No galley floor. No woman holding an oxygen bottle for 100 minutes. It was Tuesday. She did 4 of those that month. She had done, over 19 years, 311 of them. And the vast majority were exactly like that. A phone call. A chamber. A table. A man who went back to work. The flight from Male was the one everybody knew about. And it was, in the accounting of her actual professional life, 1 case out of 311. She says this to registrars. You will remember 4 cases from your career, and you will tell those 4 at dinner parties for 30 years. She tells them, the 4 will not be your best work. Your best work is the 200 boring ones, where you did it right, and it went the way it was supposed to, and nobody noticed. The famous case is the one where the system was already failing before you arrived. It is exciting precisely because things had already gone wrong. Do not build your practice around wanting more of those. Build it around the boring 200. The famous one will find you eventually. And when it does, the only thing that will save you is that you did the boring 200 properly first. On the seat back screen. On the flight home to Lagos, the cabin altitude read 7,100 feet. She looked at it, the way she had looked at that number on every aircraft she had boarded for 19 years. The way her father had checked his card in his shirt pocket before every dive for 31. 7,100. Correct. She thought, somewhere on this aeroplane there is probably somebody who dived this week. She thought, at 7,100 feet, if they did it properly, they will be fine. And they will never know that anything was ever at stake. And that is exactly right, and it is the entire object of the exercise. Then she thought, as she always did, about the 18-hour rule, which is boring, and which is printed on every certification card in the world, and which almost nobody reads, and which had been sitting quietly in a laminated pocket somewhere for 60 years, waiting for a 26-year-old with a fresh advanced card and a booked flight. Be the slow thing. She closed the screen. She slept the whole way home. The bell above the door of Solomon's Hardware did not ring so much as it wheezed. A tired brass sound that had been announcing the arrivals and departures on the 9th Street corner for 31 years. Darnell Crew knew the sound the way he knew. The specific uneven grade of the pavement outside, and the exact hour the afternoon shadows hit the storefront. He walked in on a Tuesday, out of the October wind that was already threatening November's freeze, and found that the store was not empty. And the people in it were not buying hardware. Solomon was standing behind the counter. His hands, which were usually resting flat on the worn glass in the posture of a man who owned his space, were in his pockets. And standing on the customer side of the glass was Sergeant Calvin Pierce. Pierce was new to the district, transferred in 3 weeks ago from the downtown division, and he wore the uniform differently than Darnell did. Darnell wore it like work clothes. Pierce wore it like a tailored suit. He was a black man in his late 30s, smooth-shaved, meticulously pressed, with the specific, aggressive polish of an officer who had already mapped out the route to captain and saw the Carver Street district purely as a stepping stone to be polished and discarded. Pierce was holding a clipboard. Next to him stood a city code enforcement officer looking intensely uncomfortable, shifting his weight from his left foot to his right and avoiding Solomon's eyes. It's not about tradition. Solomon, Pierce was saying, his voice, a smooth, resonant baritone that filled the narrow aisles of the store, vibrating against the racks of PVC piping and power tools. It's about compliance. The sidewalk display violates Municipal Code 411A. You've got bags of rock, salt, and snowmelt stacked 3 feet past the permissible boundary. That's an accessibility hazard. It's a liability. And the city is no longer in the business of looking the other way just because a business has been here since the Reagan administration. Solomon looked at Pierce. And then he looked past Pierce's shoulder and saw Darnell. Solomon's expression did not change, but the tension in his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The specific physical release of a man who realizes he is no longer entirely alone in a hostile room. Sergeant, Darnell said, announcing his presence loudly enough to cut through the baritone. Pierce turned. The smile he gave Darnell was professionally flawless and entirely devoid of warmth. It was a smile engineered for promotional photographs. Crew, just doing a little community walkthrough, making sure our local businesses are staying within the lines. Setting the standard. Darnell walked further into the store, his boots heavy on the scuffed linoleum. Solomon's salt bags have been in that exact spot every October for 30 years. Darnell said. The wheelchair clearance on the sidewalk is 48 inches. Code requires 36. I measured it myself last winter when the plows pushed the snowbanks up. It's not a hazard. Pierce's smile tightened at the edges, the polish thinning just enough to show the machinery underneath. Code also requires a commercial display permit for anything extending beyond the awning line. He doesn't have one on file. I checked the municipal database this morning. Pierce tapped the clipboard with a heavy, gold-plated pen. We're issuing a citation and a notice to cure within 48 hours, or the fines compound daily at $200 a strike. A commercial display permit costs $400, Solomon said, speaking for the first time. His voice was gravelly, tired, carrying the weight of a man who had survived 3 recessions and 2 neighborhood panics, but was currently doing the arithmetic on a pink slip of paper. The salt bags bring in maybe $200 in profit over the whole winter. If I have to move them inside, I don't have the floor space. If I pay the permit, I'll lose money. Then I suggest you stop selling rock salt. My friend, Pierce said, as if offering a genuine piece of friendly advice. The neighborhood is changing. Carver Street is modernizing. The businesses that survive are the ones that adapt to the standards. The ones that don't. Pierce let the sentence hang, filling the quiet space in the hardware store with implied gravity. Well, you can't stop progress. Progress has a schedule. A citation for salt bags, Darnell said, keeping his voice level. The same calm, anchoring register he had used with the screaming man in the bathrobe 2 weeks prior. In 14 years on this beat, I've never seen the precinct accompany a code enforcement officer for a sidewalk violation unless it was a coordinated sweep of the whole district. I'm taking a proactive approach to the district. Crew, Pierce said. Commander Prentice asked for initiative. I'm providing it. A clean street is a safe street. The broken windows theory applied to retail. We don't wait for the glass to shatter. We cite the crack. Pierce handed the pink citation slip across the counter. Solomon did not reach for it. It sat on the glass, neon and accusatory, next to a display of brass hinges. 48 hours, Pierce said. He turned his back on Solomon entirely and looked at Darnell. Walk with me. Crew, let's get some air. Darnell looked at Solomon. I'll be back. The look said. Solomon gave a fractional nod, his hands still buried deep in his pockets. Darnell followed Pierce out the wheezing door and onto the sidewalk. The cold air hit them immediately, biting through the standard-issue uniform jackets. Pierce dismissed the code enforcement officer with a flick of his chin, and the man scurried off toward a municipal sedan parked halfway down the block, clearly relieved to be excused from whatever conversation was about to happen. Pierce waited until they were alone on the corner of 9th. He watched the municipal sedan pull away, and then he dropped the smooth, public-facing baritone and shifted into a register that was much quieter and considerably sharper. The performance was over. Let me explain how this is going to work. Crew, Pierce said, adjusting his duty belt with a sharp, practiced tug. I've been going through the logs. I've been looking at your activity, and I've been hearing rumors from Holloway about some little informal network you're running. Stopping in at apartments, having tea with elderly residents, playing the unofficial mayor of Carver Street. It's community policing. Sergeant, Darnell said. He stood completely still, refusing to yield an inch of the sidewalk. I talk to the people who live here. They tell me what's happening. I bring the actionable intelligence to the precinct. Commander Prentice signed off on the initiative. Prentice humored you because you brought her one good tip on the 1,422 narcotics bust, Pierce said dismissively. She likes the optics of it. A neighborhood cop holding hands with the locals. But I am your direct supervisor now. And I don't run my shift on neighborhood gossip and tea parties. I run it on metrics, arrests, citation, cleared warrants, things I can put on a spreadsheet and hand to the deputy chief. Pierce stepped closer, invading Darnell's personal space with the deliberate calculation of a man testing a boundary to see if the structure would hold. You think you're helping these people. You're not. You're holding them back. Carver Street is sitting on prime real estate. Developers from across the river are finally looking at this district. The city wants capital pouring into these blocks. And money doesn't pour into blocks where the hardware store looks like a flea market and the second-floor apartments are packed with people who can't pay their rent. We are going to clean this district up. By the book. Aggressively. By harassing a 69-year-old man over rock salt? Darnell asked. By establishing a baseline? Pierce corrected. Solomon will close up shop by spring. He can't afford the new compliance regime. And his nephew from Philly doesn't have the capital to float the fines. Someone will buy that corner lot, goot it, and put in a boutique grocery or a high-end cafe. Property values go up. Crime goes down. That's the ecosystem. Crew. You're either part of the cleanup or you're part of the debris. You want to push the residents out, Darnell said, naming the thing plainly, pulling it out of the polished corporate language and laying it bare on the concrete. The people who survived the worst years of this neighborhood, who kept it alive when the city wouldn't even send a plow down this street in January. You want to make it too expensive and too difficult for them to stay. So developers can cash in. Pierce laughed, a short, dry sound that barely parted his lips. I want a safe district. If the people currently living here can't afford a safe district, that's economics, not malice. So developers can cash in. Pierce laughed, a short, dry sound that barely parted his lips. I want a safe district. If the people currently living here can't afford a safe district, that's economics, not malice. Don't be naive. Darnell, you're a smart guy. You've got a kid, right? Little girl? Darnell felt the immediate, cold spike of adrenaline that always accompanied the mention of Amara in the mouth of a threat. He felt the folded corner of the crayon drawing resting in his right jacket pocket. The heavy, physical anchor of it. He pushed the adrenaline down, burying it deep beneath the discipline he had built over 14 years. Leave my daughter out of this. I'm just saying, Pierce said, raising his hands in mock surrender, his eyes gleaming with the specific satisfaction of a man who had found the exposed nerve. You want to provide for her. You want to make detective eventually. You want the pension to be there when you retire. You don't get there by playing social worker to people who are going to be priced out of this zip code in 18 months anyway. You get there by playing the game the way the brass wants it played. Shut down the informal network. Stop the tea parties. Get back on the radio and start writing paper. Because if I find out you're undermining my compliance, sweeps, I will bury you in so much administrative discipline, you'll be writing parking tickets in the municipal impound lot until the day you turn in your badge. Pierce tapped Darnell twice on the shoulder, a patronizing, familiar gesture. 2 solid thumps of a heavy hand. Think about it. Crew, progress is coming. Get on the right side of the ledger. Pierce turned and walked away, heading toward his cruiser, parked in the red zone. Darnell stood on the corner of 9th, feeling the October wind cut through his uniform, and knew with absolute certainty that the war for Carver Street had just shifted from the shadows to the sidewalk. Thursday afternoon arrived with a heavy, bruised sky that threatened sleet, but only delivered a bitter, driving rain. Darnell finished his shift at 3, picked up Amara from his mother's apartment on the floor below, and walked the 3 blocks to the green building on the 1400 block. Amara wore her yellow rain boots and stomped in the shallow puddles with the specific, methodical joy of a 6-year-old testing the physics of water displacement. She held a plastic folder tightly to her chest underneath her coat to protect the new drawings she had made. Loretta walked on Darnell's other side, holding a blue umbrella that shielded the three of them. "You're quiet," Loretta said, not looking at him, watching the street. "Just thinking," Darnell said. When a man says he's just thinking, he's usually thinking about a fight he hasn't had yet, or a fight he just lost. Loretta said, "Which one is it?" "A little of both," Darnell admitted. They reached the green building and buzzed 3B. Mrs. Elstrom buzzed them in instantly. The apartment smelled of Earl Grey tea and the faint, dusty scent of old paper. Mrs. Elstrom was sitting at her desk in the small back study. The filebox Carver State District resident notes 1,998 present open in front of her. She wore a heavy knit cardigan and had her walker positioned securely against the edge of the desk. "You're wet," she said by way of greeting. "It's raining," Amara said, pulling the plastic folder from under her coat. "I kept the Ferdinand drawings dry. I drew Ferdinand eating a worm. But Nana said sparrows eat seeds, so I had to draw a seed over the worm." "A necessary correction," Mrs. Elstrom said. She pointed to the kitchen table. "The colored pencils are out. There are fresh sheets of paper. If you look closely today, the sparrows are fluffing their feathers against the cold. It changes their silhouette." Amara marched into the kitchen, entirely focused on the task. Loretta followed her. Putting the kettle back on the stove, Darnell sat in the chair across from Mrs. Elstrom's desk. The radiator hissed in the corner, fighting the chill radiating from the window panes. "What happened on Tuesday at Solomon's store?" Mrs. Elstrom asked. She did not bother with preamble. "You saw that?" Darnell said. "I didn't see the inside of the store. I saw the municipal sedan park. I saw the code enforcement officer go in, followed by a patrol sergeant I didn't recognize. And I saw them come out." The code enforcement officer looked relieved. The sergeant looked pleased. "You came out a minute later looking like a man who had just been handed a problem he couldn't solve with a ticket." Darnell let out a long breath. He told her about Sergeant Calvin Pierce, about the rock salt citation, about the $400 permit, and about the conversation on the corner. He laid out the exact phrasing Pierce had used, times establishing a baseline, priced out of this zip code, progress has a schedule. Mrs. Elstrom listened with the complete, unbroken stillness she brought to all incoming data. She did not interrupt. She did not react. She merely absorbed the information, filing it into the vast architecture of the 26 years of knowledge she carried. When he finished, she reached into the box. She did not pull out the notebook she usually used for the weekly logs. She pulled out a thicker, older ledger, bound in cracked black leather. "When I retired from teaching," Mrs. Elstrom said, adjusting her glasses, "I began tracking the residents. But about 8 years ago, I realized that tracking the residents wasn't enough. People don't just leave neighborhoods randomly. They leave because the environment becomes hostile to their presence. So I started tracking the property." She opened the black ledger. The pages were filled with printed spreadsheets, stapled and taped to the paper, overlaid with her precise handwriting. "This is public record," she said. "If you know where to look, I go to the municipal archives online. I look at deed transfers, property tax assessments, LLC registrations." She tapped a page. 3 weeks ago, an LLC called Vanguard Holdings purchased the empty lot behind the pharmacy. 2 weeks ago, they bought the abandoned dry cleaner on 8th. Yesterday, the deed transferred for the building next to Solomon's. Darnell leaned forward, looking at the columns of data. Vanguard Holdings. A shell company, she said. Registered in Delaware, but the signatory on the municipal tax forms is a man named Richard Vance. Vance, Darnell said. The name clicked into place. He's a developer. He bought up 4 blocks in the River District right before the city announced the new transit hub. Flipped them for luxury condos. The long-term residents there got squeezed out by aggressive code enforcement and skyrocketing assessments. Exactly, Mrs. Elstrom said. And now he is looking at Carver Street. But Vanguard Holdings cannot buy buildings if the current owners won't sell. Solomon owns his building outright. Cecile's landlord is a family trust that has refused to sell for decades. The only way Vanguard gets this block is if the businesses become unprofitable and the residential buildings become too burdensome for the landlords to maintain. Pierce, Darnell said, the realization settling over him like a physical weight. Pierce isn't just an ambitious cop making a name for himself. He's the pressure. He's generating the citations. He's creating the financial burden. Rock-salt citations for Solomon. Mrs. Elstrom said. She turned a page in the ledger. Noise complaints for Cecile's building. Fines for improperly secured trash bins for the baker on 10th. Pierce is weaponizing the municipal code. He is manufacturing a hostile environment to force sales. Darnell stared at the ledger. He told me on the corner. He practically gave me the playbook. He said Solomon would close by spring because he couldn't afford the compliance regime. Pierce knows exactly what he's doing. He is establishing the baseline. Mrs. Elstrom said, repeating Pierce's phrase with clinical precision. But there is a gap in his methodology. What gap? Code enforcement cannot target specific buildings unilaterally without a documented history of complaints. She said, to justify the sweeps, to justify sending a police sergeant as an escort, there has to be a paper trail of citizen complaints requesting intervention. Darnell frowned. You think someone is filing fake complaints? I don't think it. I know it. Mrs. Elstrom reached into the box and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I requested the public logs for 311 calls in the Carver District for the last 30 days. There has been a 400% increase in anonymous complaints regarding sidewalk obstructions, noise violations, and sanitation hazards. All of them localized to the exact buildings Vanguard Holdings needs to acquire to complete a continuous block. Darnell took the sheet of paper. The data was undeniable. Who is making the calls? They are anonymous, she said. But the timestamps are interesting. They are almost entirely logged between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. She looked at Darnell, who is awake and walking this district between 11 and 2. Taking note of which trash bins are unlocked and which salt bags are 3 inches over the line, Darnell felt a cold anger bloom in his chest. Pierce's night shift units. He's having his own officers call in the anonymous 311 complaints to generate the paper trail, which then justifies the daytime code enforcement sweeps. It is an elegant, closed-loop system of harassment, Mrs. Elstrom said, and it is entirely invisible unless you happen to have 26 years of baseline data to compare it against. Darnell looked at the 78-year-old woman sitting in her cardigan. He thought about the precinct commanders looking at spreadsheets, congratulating Pierce on his initiative, completely blind to the machinery of displacement operating right under their noses. What do we do? Darnell asked. I can't take this to Holloway. Holloway is a good man, but he answers to Pierce now. Pierce is the sector supervisor. If I bring this up the chain, Pierce will bury it, and he'll bury me for insubordination. You don't take it up the chain, Mrs. Elstrom said. You break the loop. The opportunity to break the loop presented itself the following Tuesday. Darnell was walking the 1,400 block, the cold rain having given way to a brittle, cloudless freeze. He was approaching Cecile's building when he saw Diana, the family support worker, standing on the stoop. She was holding her heavy canvas bag, and she looked furious. Darnell crossed the street quickly. Diana. What happened? Diana turned. Her jaw was set tight. I just spent an hour with Cecile. She received a formal notice of eviction from the family trust that owns the building. 30 days to vacate. Darnell felt the ground shift. On what grounds? She pays her rent. The kids have been doing better. You said the intervention was holding. It is holding, Diana said sharply. She's doing everything right. The kids are in the after-school program. The hallway is clear, but the eviction notice isn't about rent. It cites the nuisance clause in her lease. It claims she is generating a hazardous environment due to repeated bybrands. Documented police presence at her unit. Darnell stared at her. Police presence? I haven't been called to this building in a month. You haven't, Diana said. But someone has. Cecile showed me the log attached to the notice. 6 anonymous noise complaints in the last 3 weeks. All dispatched to the midnight shift. All resulting in a patrol car showing up at her door at 2 a.m. Waking the kids up. Terrifying her. The officers write up a disturbance report, even though there's no noise, just to clear the call. The landlord gets the reports. 6 strikes. And they trigger the nuisance clause. Pierce. Darnell breathed. What? It's Pierce. He's using the midnight shift to fabricate the police presence. Darnell looked up at the building. Vanguard Holdings needed Cecile's building to complete the block. The family trust wouldn't sell if the building was generating stable rental income. But if the building became a liability, if it was generating constant police reports and municipal headaches, they would sell to the first developer offering cash. Pierce was weaponizing the police department to terrorize a single mother out of her home. Darnell, Diana said, her voice dropping, carrying the specific weight of someone who needed an absolute truth. Cecile was crying. She said she's going to lose the kids if she ends up in the shelter system. We worked so hard to stabilize this family. If she gets evicted, the whole structure collapses. She is not getting evicted, Darnell said. The notice is legal. The police reports are in the system. The reports are fraudulent, Darnell said. I'm going to prove it. Proving it required Darnell to do something he had spent 14 years meticulously avoiding. He had to operate outside the boundaries of the precinct's established protocol. At 1 a.m. on Wednesday night, long after his day shift had ended, Darnell sat in his unmarked personal vehicle parked in the alleyway behind the 1,400 block. He had a thermos of coffee, his notebook, and a clear line of sight to Cecile's building. The street was dead quiet. The temperature hovered near freezing. Darnell watched the shadows stretch across the brickwork, waiting for the machinery to move. At 42 a.m., a patrol cruiser turned onto Carver Street, moving slowly, its headlights cutting through the dark. It did not have its light bar engaged. It rolled to a stop directly in front of Cecile's building. Darnell recognized the vehicle number. It was Officer Miller, a rookie who had graduated from the academy 6 months ago, desperate to make a good impression on his new sector supervisor. Sergeant Pierce. Miller stepped out of the cruiser. He did not look rushed. He did not look like a man responding to a legitimate noise complaint. He walked up the stoop, pressed the buzzer for Cecile's unit, and waited. Darnell raised his phone and began recording through the windshield. He watched Miller stand on the stoop for 3 minutes. He watched the lights click on in Cecile's second-floor window. He watched Miller enter the building, stay for exactly 4 minutes, and then exit. Miller walked back to his cruiser, got in, and sat there typing on his mobile data terminal. Darnell knew exactly what Miller was typing. Dispatched to noise complaint. Made contact with resident. Warned and advised. Call cleared. It was a perfectly clean, perfectly bureaucratic piece of violence. Darnell put the car in gear, pulled out of the alley, and blocked the cruiser from pulling away. Miller's head snapped up. He recognized Darnell's face in the headlights and rolled his window down. Looking confused. "Crew? What are you doing out here? You're not on shift." Darnell got out of his car and walked up to Miller's window. The cold air plumed around his mouth as he breathed. "Neither are you." "Miller." "Not really." "Who called in the complaint?" Miller frowned, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Dispatch. Anonymous. 311 transfer." "There was no noise," Darnell said. "I've been sitting in the alley for 2 hours. The building was dead silent until you buzzed the door and woke up 3 kids and a mother who has to be at work at 6 in the morning. I'm just answering the call." "Crew," Miller said defensively. "Dispatch sends it. I clear it. That's the job." "Who initiated the 311 call?" "Miller." Darnell leaned down, putting his face close to the window, his voice dropping into the register that left no room for evasion. "Don't lie to me. I know you're new. I know you want to impress Pierce. But you are participating in a fraudulent harassment campaign to evict a single mother so a developer can buy her building. If you put your name on that clearance report, you are committing official misconduct." Miller's face went pale. The Academy bravado vanished, replaced by the genuine panic of a 22-year-old realizing he had stepped into something much deeper than he understood. "I didn't call it in," Miller stammered. "Pierce did. He texted me on my personal phone. Told me to swing by 1422 and log a disturbance. He said it was part of a long-term nuisance abatement strategy. I just did what the sergeant ordered." Darnell felt the cold iron of the truth lock into place. "Show me the text." Miller hesitated, looking at his lap. "Show me the text." "Miller. Or I take this video of you conducting a fraudulent knock directly to internal affairs tomorrow morning. And Pierce will throw you under the bus to save his own career." Miller fumbled for his phone, pulled up the messages, and handed it through the window. Darnell looked at the screen. "Pierce. Need a knock at 1422. Unit 2, B. Log it as a noise warning. Building the file for the landlord." Darnell took out his own phone and photographed the screen. He handed Miller's phone back. "Don't log the report," Darnell said. "Clear the call as unfounded. No contact made. If Pierce asks, tell him the resident didn't answer the door. He's going to kill me," Miller said, his voice shaking. "He's not going to have the chance." Darnell said, "Drive away." Miller. "And don't come back to this block unless there's a real emergency." The locker room at the precinct was empty at 6 a.m. It smelled of damp wool and industrial disinfectant. Darnell was sitting on the bench in front of his locker, fully dressed in his uniform, waiting. At Chasse, Chinchis Brzach. Sergeant Calvin Pierce walked in. He was carrying a gym bag and humming softly, looking energized and impeccably sharp. He stopped when he saw Darnell. The humming ceased. Pierce looked around the empty room, assessing the tactical reality of the situation, and then smiled, his flawless, empty smile. "Crew, you're early for day shift. Eager to hit the streets?" Darnell did not stand up. He looked at Pierce from the bench. "I have a text message. Sergeant. From your personal phone to Officer Miller's personal phone, instructing him to fabricate a police report at 1422 Carver." Pierce's smile did not waver, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. He walked slowly toward his locker, placing his gym bag on the bench opposite Darnell. I don't know what you're talking about. Miller must be confused. I issue directives regarding nuisance abatement. If he misinterpreted my orders, that's a training issue. It's not a training issue, Darnell said. It's extortion. You are generating fraudulent municipal data to trigger eviction clauses and levy unpayable fines. You are acting as the enforcement arm for Vanguard Holdings. Richard Vance is buying the properties you drive the residents out of. Pierce opened his locker and began taking out his uniform. He did not look at Darnell. You have a very active imagination. Crew, you've been spending too much time listening to the crazy old woman in 3B. I know you visit her. I know you sit in her living room. You think you're gathering intelligence? You're just drinking tea with a dinosaur. Pierce turned around, holding his pressed uniform shirt. The veneer of polite professionalism was gone. Let me tell you what happens now. Darnell, you take that photograph of a text message and you delete it. Because if you bring it to Prentice, I will deny it. Miller will deny it. Because I will remind him that I evaluate his probationary period, and then I will open an investigation into your unofficial activities. I will audit every hour you've spent inside residential apartments while on duty. I will find a violation. And I will strip you of your badge. Pierce took a step forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You have a daughter, Amara. You need this job to keep that roof over her head. You need the pension. You are a single black father in a city that doesn't care if you live or die. You have zero margin for error. Do not throw your life away trying to save a neighborhood that is already dead. Darnell sat on the bench. He felt the weight of the threat. It was the heaviest, most precise weapon Pierce possessed. Pierce knew the arithmetic. He knew the gap between the job you cannot lose and the child you cannot leave. Darnell reached into his right jacket pocket. He touched the edge of the folded paper, the crayon drawing, the police car, the sun, the wide arms that kept the road safe. He stood up. He was 3 inches taller than Pierce, and considerably broader in the shoulders. And when he stood up, the space in the locker room suddenly felt incredibly small. You did your research, Sergeant, Darnell said, his voice entirely devoid of fear. You found the thing that matters to me, but you misunderstood what it means. Pierce looked up at him, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his eyes. You think having a daughter makes me vulnerable, Darnell said. You think it means I'll back down to protect my paycheck? But you don't understand the job. My daughter drew a picture of me. She drew a badge. She thinks the badge means I stop the bad things from happening. She doesn't know about Vanguard Holdings, or municipal codes, or Poncian. She just knows that when someone is hurting people, her father stops it. Darnell stepped closer, forcing Pierce to tilt his head back. I'm not deleting the photograph. I'm taking it to Commander Prentice at 0800, along with 26 years of handwritten documentation proving exactly how this neighborhood functions, and a sworn statement from a mother who was forced to choose between feeding her kids and paying a fraudulent fine. You think you have the power because you know how to use the bureaucracy. But I have the street. I have Solomon. I have Cecile. I have Mrs. Elstrom. And I have the truth. Prentice won't risk the fallout, Pierce said, his voice tightening. A scandal like this makes the whole precinct look dirty. Prentice is a cop, Darnell said. She cares about the badge more than the optics. We'll see which one of us she believes. Darnell walked past Pierce, heading for the locker room door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back. You thought you were establishing a baseline, Calvin, but you miscalculated. You picked a fight with a block that remembers everything. The meeting in Commander Prentice's office took 3 hours. Darnell laid the photograph on the desk. He laid Mrs. Elstrom's black ledger beside it. Deanna, the family support worker, sat in the chair next to Darnell and provided the documentation of Cecile's eviction notice and the corresponding fraudulent police logs. Prentice sat behind her desk, reading the ledger, reading the text message, listening to the timeline. She did not interrupt. She possessed the same quality of deep, terrifying stillness that Mrs. Elstrom had. When it was over, Prentice closed the ledger. She looked at Darnell. "This is going to burn," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Darnell said, "Internal Affairs will suspend Pierce pending investigation. The developer, Vance, will claim he had no knowledge of Pierce's methods. The City Council will demand an audit. It will be ugly. Crew, you will be dragged into the center of it." "I understand," Darnell said. Prentice looked at the ledger again. 26 years, she murmured. She mapped the whole thing. She looked up. "Go back to your shift. Officer Crew, I have phone calls to make." Sergeant Calvin Pierce was escorted out of the precinct by Internal Affairs at 2 p.m. that afternoon. The news moved through the Carver Street district the way news moves quietly, rapidly, passing from the hardware store to the bakery. From the second-floor apartments to the park benches, Darnell walked his beat on Thursday. He did not swagger. He did not broadcast what had happened. He walked the same uneven pavement, checking the same corners. He stopped at Solomon's hardware. Solomon was behind the counter, instructing his nephew Aaron on how to cut keys. The pink citation slip was gone. "Afternoon, Darnell," Solomon said. "Solomon," Darnell said. "Aaron, got a notice in the mail this morning?" Solomon said, not looking up from the key machine. City rescinded the citation, said it was issued in error. "Is that right?" Darnell said. "Must have been a paperwork glitch." Solomon said, the edges of his eyes crinkled. "We're keeping the salt bags outside." "Good place for them," Darnell said. He walked to the green building on the 1400 block. He buzzed 3B. Mrs. Elstrom opened the door. The apartment smelled of tea. Loretta was simply at the kitchen table, and Amara was beside her, coloring intensely. Darnell went into the study. Mrs. Elstrom followed him and sat at the desk. The box was closed. "Pierce is gone," Darnell said. "I heard." Mrs. Elstrom said. Cecile's landlord withdrew the eviction notice. The trust claims they were operating on faulty municipal data. Vanguard Holdings pulled out of the escrow on the building next to Solomon's. Darnell added, "When the pressure stopped, the economics didn't make sense anymore." Mrs. Elstrom nodded slowly. She placed her hand on the lid of the box. "The connection worked," she said. "The connection worked." Darnell agreed. He looked toward the kitchen. Amara was marching into the study, holding a piece of paper. She handed it to Mrs. Elstrom. It was a drawing of the hardware store. It showed Solomon, drawn with a large gray beard, and bags of rock salt stacked neatly on the sidewalk. Above the store, a yellow sun was shining. "That is Solomon's store," Amara announced. "It is very accurate." Mrs. Elstrom said, "Daddy says Solomon is staying," Amara said. Mrs. Elstrom looked at Darnell. Her bright blue eyes sharp and clear. "Yes," she said. "He is staying, because some people make sure the street stays safe." Darnell reached into his pocket. He touched the folded crayon drawing. He did not pull it out. He just kept his hand resting over it, feeling the weight of the paper, the weight of the promise, the weight of the Thursday afternoon sun coming through the third-floor window, lighting up the empty window boxes that were waiting for the spring. The geraniums in the window boxes of apartment 3B were exactly as Amara had been told. Precisely red. It was the third week of April. A Tuesday afternoon on Carver Street, and the air had finally broken out of the brittle chill of early spring, settling into the kind of heavy, golden warmth that pulled the neighborhood out onto the stoops. Darnell Crew walked the 1400 block in uniform, feeling the specific, quiet rhythm of a district that had, over the last 6 months, remembered how to breathe. Solomon's nephew, Aaron, was out front of the hardware store, sweeping the sidewalk past the bags of rock salt that had long since been swapped out for bags of potting soil. Up on the second floor of the green building, Cecile's windows were open, the sound of her kids laughing over a cartoon spilling out into the street. It was a Tuesday. It was an ordinary Tuesday. And then a black Mercedes town car pulled smoothly into the bus lane at the corner of Carver and 9th, its hazard lights flashing in absolute, arrogant silence. And the ordinary Tuesday ended. Darnell stopped. He felt the immediate, cold spike of adrenaline that 11 years of patrol work wires into your nervous system when something wrong enters a quiet space. The back door of the Mercedes opened, and Calvin Pierce stepped onto the pavement. Pierce was no longer wearing the uniform of a police sergeant. He was wearing a charcoal gray wool suit, cut with the aggressive, frictionless precision of a man who paid other people to think about his measurements. His shoes were polished Italian leather. He looked at the hardware store, and at the green building, and finally, he looked at Darnell. He smiled the flawless, empty smile of a man who had not come to argue, but to collect. Darnell crossed the street, his boots heavy on the asphalt. He stopped 3 feet from Pierce. "You're out of your jurisdiction, Calvin," Darnell said, his voice flat, dropping the title because Pierce had been stripped of the badge 5 months ago. "And you're parked in a bus lane. I'll pay the ticket out of pocket." "Crew," Pierce said, adjusting his French cuffs with slow, deliberate care. "Consider it a donation to the municipal fund. Though, honestly, I shouldn't have to subsidize a city I'm actively trying to save from its own decay." Pierce reached into the back seat of the Mercedes and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He didn't look angry. He didn't look defeated. He looked exactly like a man who had realized the rules of the game were optional if you simply bought the board. "I told you last October that progress had a schedule," Pierce said, his baritone smooth and resonant, vibrating over the noise of the traffic on 9th. "You thought you won because you got Commander Prentice to pull my badge over some noise complaints and a few hurt feelings. You thought that little file box of neighborhood gossip made you a savior, but the badge was just a tool. Darnell, it was actually slowing me down. The internal affairs review, the suspension, it was the best thing you ever did for my career. It forced me to go private. You went to work for Richard Vance," Darnell said, naming the developer who owned Vanguard Holdings, the shell company that had been trying to buy the block. "I went to work as the director of acquisitions for Vanguard," Pierce corrected, tapping the leather portfolio with a heavy gold pen. "And I don't have to play by precinct rules anymore. I don't need anonymous 311 calls. I don't need midnight shift rookies making fake reports. I just need capital and municipal code." Pierce stepped closer, invading Darnell's space, the smell of expensive cologne masking the cold sweat of the city street. "You see, Crew, you can hold a door for an old lady, and you can buy a kid a granola bar, and you can play the unofficial mayor of Carver Street all you want, But you are a civil servant, playing savior on a block of ghosts. These people have no capital. They have no leverage. And as of this morning, they have no legal right to occupy these buildings. Pierce handed Darnell a thick, stapled document. The cover page bore the seal of the City Department of Buildings. Stamped over the letterhead of Times Apex Structural Engineering. "What is this?" Darnell asked, though the cold iron in his stomach already knew. "Municipal Code, 8-44. Pierce said smoothly. "Emergency condemnation for imminent structural failure." Vanguard Holdings didn't just try to buy these buildings. Darnell, we bought the subterranean rights to the alleyways, which gave our private engineering firm, Apex Structural, the legal right to inspect the shared foundations. And what a tragedy. Apex found deep, unrecoverable stress fractures in the foundation of Solomon's hardware store and the green residential building at 1422. Imminent collapse hazards. Darnell stared at the paper. There are no stress fractures. Those buildings have stood for 80 years. Apex Structural disagrees, Pierce said, his smile widening into a shark's grin. And the city's Department of Buildings is legally obligated to act immediately on a certified hazard report from a licensed firm. It's a liability issue. They don't have the budget to send their own inspectors to verify. So they rubber stamp the emergency order. Pierce gestured up the street. A white city utility van had just pulled up behind the Mercedes. 2 men in neon vests got out, carrying rolls of heavy red tape and stacks of neon orange placards. "Notice to vacate," Pierce said, savoring the syllables. 48 hours. No appeals. No stays of execution. The residents are pulled out. The city condemns the lots. And Vanguard buys the condemned dirt for pennies on the dollar from the landlords, who are suddenly holding worthless, uninsurable property. Pierce leaned in, dropping his voice to a whisper meant only for Darnell to hear. "You fought so hard to keep me from writing them parking tickets, Darnell, so I decided to just take the concrete out from under their feet." Darnell watched the 2 men in neon vests walk up to the glass door of Solomon's hardware. Aaron stepped out, holding his broom, looking confused. One of the men slapped a massive neon orange sticker directly in the center of the glass. Condemned. Unsafe for human occupancy. Vacate within 48 hours. "You can't stop this." "Crew," Pierce said, "you don't have the rank. You don't have the money. And your little neighborhood watch doesn't have the jurisdiction to overrule a certified structural engineer. The block is dead. I'm just here to collect the bodies." Pierce turned, got back into the leather-scented quiet of the Mercedes, and the car pulled away, leaving Darnell standing on the pavement with the fraudulent report in his hand, watching the neon orange stickers bloom like a virus down the 1400 block of Carver Street. The smell of packing tape is the smell of panic. It is a sharp, chemical scent. And when Darnell walked into Cecile's apartment on the 2nd floor of the green building an hour later, the air was thick with it. Cecile was standing in the center of her living room, weeping silently as she threw winter coats and children's shoes into a cardboard box. Her 3 kids were sitting on a bare mattress in the corner, holding their backpacks, staring at the floor with the wide, terrified eyes of children who know their world is ending but do not understand why. Deanna, the family support worker, was already there. She looked up when Darnell walked in, her face drawn tight with a fury that was vibrating just under her skin. They slid the buyout papers under her door, 10 minutes after the city posted the vacate notice on the lobby glass. Diana said, her voice a low, furious hiss. "Vanguard's lawyers, offering a $2,000 relocation stipend if she signs a waiver abandoning her lease rights immediately. If she doesn't sign, she gets nothing. And she still has to be out by Thursday morning. $2,000 won't even cover first and last month's rent on a studio in a neighborhood 3 miles from here. I can't go to the shelter. Darnell. Cecile choked out, dropping a roll of tape. If we go to the shelter, they split the family up. The boys go to the men's dorm. The baby stays with me. I can't do it. We were doing so well. We were finally doing well. Darnell stepped over a pile of folded blankets. He reached into his right jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the folded crayon drawing Amara had given him 2 weeks ago. He grounded himself in the texture of the paper. He looked at Cecile. You are not signing that waiver, Darnell said. His voice was the heavy, immovable anchor he used on the darkest nights of the beat. And you are not going to a shelter. The notice on the door says 48 hours, Cecile cried, her voice cracking. The police will come and drag us out. I am the police, Darnell said, and I am telling you, no one is dragging you out. Put the tape down. Gisile, unpack the coats. Darnell, Diana said quietly, stepping closer to him. The order is signed by the Department of Buildings. You can't just stand in the doorway and fight off a city eviction team. It's a certified structural report. The report is a lie, Darnell said. Calvin Pierce bought an engineering firm to print a piece of paper that makes a lie look like math. He turned and looked up at the ceiling. He looked toward the 3rd floor. And a lie that looks like math is exactly what we have a specialist for. He left Cecile's apartment and took the stairs, 2 at a time, to the 3rd floor. He didn't even have to buzz. The door to apartment 3B was already open. Mrs. Margaret Elstrom was sitting at her desk in the study. The file box times Carver State District resident notes 1,998% times was open. Her walker was parked against the wall. Loretta, Darnell's mother, was sitting at the small kitchen table. A cup of tea untouched in front of her. I saw the van. Mrs. Elstrom said. She didn't look up from the thick, black leather ledger she was currently paging through. I saw Pierce. I went down to the lobby and read the notice. Code 8 bis 44, Darnell said, stepping into the study. Imminent structural failure. Pierce claims Vanguard hired a firm called Apex Structural, and they found deep stress fractures in the shared foundation of this building and Solomon's store. Apex Structural. Mrs. Elstrom repeated. She said the name the way a person might say the name of a particularly unimpressive insect. She turned a page in the ledger. An interesting choice of weapon. Can we fight it? Loretta asked from the kitchen. Darnell. Cecile is terrified down there. Solomon is talking about sending Aaron back to Philly because there won't be a store left to run. If the city says the building is falling down, who argues with the city? I do. Mrs. Elstrom said. She stopped turning pages and flattened her hand against a spread from 2019. To trigger a code 8-4, for emergency condemnation without a mandatory 90-day review period. The structural engineering report must prove that the decay is both immediate and untraceable to standard settling. They have to prove sudden, catastrophic shifting. She looked up at Darnell, her bright blue eyes sharp and terrifyingly clear. In August of 2019, she said, the city replaced the subterranean sewer mains on the Carver corridor. To do so, they had to excavate the alleyway between this building and Solomon's store, exposing the entire eastern foundation wall to a depth of 14 feet. The excavation lasted 6 weeks. Darnell stared at her. You took notes. I did not just take notes, Mrs. Elstrom said. She reached into the back of the box and pulled out a heavy manila envelope. I took photographs Because the heavy machinery was causing vibrations in my third-floor window, and I wanted a record of the foundation's integrity in case the construction caused damage that the city tried to deny later. She opened the envelope and spread a dozen glossy 8x10 photographs across the desk. They were meticulously dated and time-stamped. They showed the exposed concrete foundation of the green building and the hardware store. The concrete was pristine, thick, unbroken, and solid as bedrock. A foundation does not develop catastrophic deep vein stress fractures in 5 years unless there is a seismic event or a sinkhole. Mrs. Elstrom said, and since Carver Street has not experienced an earthquake, the report filed by Apex Structural, claiming 50-year decay, is a physical impossibility. The report is fraudulent. Darnell felt the air rush back into his lungs. The proof was right here. 26 years of paying attention had caught a lie that a $50 million developer thought was bulletproof. I'll take these to Commander Prentice right now, Darnell said, reaching for the photos. Commander Prentice is a police officer. Mrs. Elstrom said, her hand coming down sharply to cover the photos. She cannot overrule the Department of Buildings on a civil code violation, regardless of what photographs you hand her. Vanguard's lawyers will simply claim my photographs are from the wrong angle, or altered, or irrelevant, to break a certified structural engineer's report. You do not need a police commander. She looked at Darnell with the absolute, unyielding authority of a woman who had taught high school chemistry for 3 decades and knew exactly how to dismantle a bad equation. You need a bigger structural engineer. Darnell frowned. Where are we going to find a certified structural engineer willing to go to war against a $50 million developer in 48 hours? Mrs. Elstrom smiled. It was a small, precise smile. I told you last October. Darnell, I taught an enormous number of people who now live and work in this city. She tapped the ledger. Priya Voss, class of 2001. Terrible at balancing equations, but very good at understanding why things broke down. Darnell finished, remembering the conversation on the sidewalk. She works at the infrastructure office. She is the Deputy Director of Municipal Infrastructure. Mrs. Elstrom corrected. And she holds a master's degree in structural engineering. Go to her office. Tell her Mrs. Elstrom requires her attendance at the Municipal Planning Board emergency hearing tomorrow morning. Tell her it is a pass-fail assignment. The municipal building downtown smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and the quiet, heavy hum of bureaucratic indifference. Darnell Crew walked into the sprawling, cubicle-lined labyrinth of the Department of Infrastructure at 4:15 p.m. He was in uniform, and his presence caused a minor ripple of nervous energy among the clerks. He didn't stop at the front desk. He walked straight to the glass-walled corner office that bore the plaque. Priya Voss, Deputy Director. He knocked once and opened the door. Priya Voss was a woman in her early 40s, wearing a tailored navy suit and glasses pushed up onto her forehead. Her desk was buried under blueprints and zoning applications. She looked up, exhausted and annoyed. If this is about the sinkhole on Delancey Street, I already told the precinct we don't have the budget to fill it until Tuesday, she said, rubbing her eyes. It's not about Delancey Street, Darnell said. He stepped up to her desk. It's about the 1400 block of Carver Street. And Mrs. Margaret Elstrom sent me. Priya froze. The annoyance vanished instantly from her face, replaced by a sudden, rigid posture that Darnell recognized perfectly. It was the posture of a former student whose teacher had just walked into the room. She pulled her glasses down to the bridge of her nose. Mrs. Elstrom, Priya said, her voice dropping a register. My God. Is she all right? She's fine, Darnell said. But her building isn't. And neither is the hardware store next door. Darnell laid the Apex structural report on the desk. Next to it, he laid the manila envelope containing Mrs. Elstrom's 2019 excavation photographs. Vanguard Holdings filed this emergency condemnation order this morning. Darnell said, "They're claiming deep vein stress fractures to force an eviction in 48 hours, so they can buy the block for a luxury transit hub. Mrs. Elstrom says the report is fraudulent. She says you're the only one who can prove it." Priya Voss looked at the Apex structural report. Her jaw tightened. "Apex," she muttered. "They're a boutique firm. They do high-end corporate compliance. They don't do residential basement inspections unless somebody is paying them a ridiculous premium to find a very specific answer." She opened the report. She flipped past the executive summary and went straight to the technical readouts. The load-bearing charts. And the structural diagrams. She read in silence for 4 minutes. The only sound in the office was the hum of the HVAC vent. Then, she stopped. She stared at a page in the middle of the report. She looked at it for a long time. Then she reached for Mrs. Elstrom's photographs. She looked at the date stamps. She looked at the raw concrete in the images. Priya Voss let out a breath that was half a laugh and half a curse. "Oh, these arrogant, lazy bastards," she whispered. "What is it?" Darnell asked. "Engineering reports for foundational decay are highly specific to the soil composition of the neighborhood," Priya said, her eyes blazing as she grabbed a red pen. "Carver Street sits on a bedrock shelf. It's hard clay and limestone. But look at this paragraph, detailing the stress fracture propagation." She circled a dense block of text. "They claim the fractures are caused by time's saline groundwater degradation and tidal shifting." Darnell frowned. "Carver Street is 4 miles inland. There's no tidal shifting." "Exactly," Priya said, slamming the pen down. "They didn't even bother to do a real inspection. They copy-pasted a structural failure report from a condemned warehouse in the River District and slapped the Carver Street address on it. And they knew the Department of Buildings is too understaffed to read past the executive summary before rubber-stamping the vacate order." She looked at Darnell, and the exhaustion was entirely gone from her face. Filing a forged structural engineering report to trigger a municipal eviction isn't just a code violation. Officer Crew, it's felony fraud. It's extortion. "Can you prove it in front of a microphone?" Darnell asked. "I can prove it in my sleep," Priya said. She stood up and grabbed her suit jacket. "What time is the emergency hearing?" 9 a.m. tomorrow, Darnell said. "Room 402. Tell Mrs. Elstrom her student is ready to present her homework," Priya said. Room 402 of the Municipal Planning Board was paneled in dark oak and smelled of old paper and powerful people making quiet deals. At 9 a.m. on Wednesday, the chamber was half full. At the front of the room, behind a long mahogany table, sat the 3 commissioners of the Planning Board. Standing at the petitioner's podium was Richard Vance, the CEO of Vanguard Holdings. He was a man in his late 50s with silver hair, an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, and the soothing, practiced voice of a man accustomed to telling people that his destruction of their lives was actually a public service. Beside him stood Calvin Pierce. Pierce held a leather briefcase, looking sharp, vigilant, and completely victorious. It is with a heavy heart that Vanguard Holdings steps in to remediate this crisis. Vance was saying into the microphone, his voice echoing off the wood paneling. The structures on the 1400 block of Carver Street represent a tragic failure of urban decay. The imminent collapse hazards identified by Apex Structural leave the city no choice. For the safety of the residents, the eviction order must stand. And Vanguard is prepared to assume the burden of clearing the lots to make way for the new Carver Transit Hub. The lead commissioner, a bored-looking man adjusting his glasses, nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." The board recognizes the Apex report. If there are no objections from the floor, we will formalize the vacate order and point of order. The voice cut through the chamber like a gunshot, heavy, immovable. Darnell Crew walked down the center aisle of room 402. He was in full uniform, his boots echoing sharply on the hardwood floor. But he was not alone. Walking beside him, leaning steadily on her walker, was Mrs. Margaret Elstrom, wearing a crisp tweed blazer and a silk scarf, her blue eyes fixed on the podium with terrifying clarity. Behind them walked Solomon, the hardware store owner, wearing his best Sunday suit, holding his hat in his hands. Beside Solomon walked Cecile, holding her youngest child on her hip, her chin raised. And flanking them all was Commander Patricia Prentice, her gold brass gleaming under the chamber lights. Calvin Pierce turned from the podium. His smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before he smoothed his features into an expression of patronizing pity. "Officer Crew," Pierce said into the microphone, "this is a civil zoning hearing. I understand you have an emotional attachment to the block. But police presence does not alter structural physics." Darnell didn't look at Pierce. He looked at the commissioners. "I am not here to alter physics," Darnell said, coming to a stop at the public microphone. "I am here to submit evidence of a crime." Vance bristled, stepping forward. "Commissioner, this is highly inappropriate. Vanguard has submitted a certified... The report submitted by Vanguard Holdings is a forgery," Darnell said, his voice filling the room, leaving no space for Vance's polished interruptions. "And I yield my time to the Deputy Director of Municipal Infrastructure to explain exactly how..." The side door of the chamber opened. Priya Voss walked in, carrying a large presentation board. She walked straight to the front of the room and placed the board on an easel facing the commissioners. Pierce's eyes darted to Priya, and for the first time, a genuine flicker of panic crossed his face. He knew who she was. "Commissioners," Priya Voss said, adjusting the microphone, "I have reviewed the Apex structural report submitted by Vanguard Holdings. The report claims the foundations of 1,422 Carver and Solomon's hardware suffer from deep vein stress fractures caused by saline groundwater degradation and tidal shifting." She tapped the presentation board. She unveiled the blown-up 8x10 glossy photographs from Mrs. Elstrom's 2019 sewer excavation files. "As you can see from these time-stamped photographs of the exposed foundation," Priya continued, her voice ringing with absolute clinical authority, "the concrete is pristine. Furthermore, Carver Street sits on a limestone shelf 4 miles from the river. There is no tidal shifting. The engineering report Vanguard submitted is a copy-pasted document stolen from a River District warehouse inspection. It is a fraudulent document submitted to this board to illegally trigger an emergency eviction under false pretenses." The chamber erupted into murmurs. The board commissioner sat straight up, his face going pale. Richard Vance gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. He leaned into the mic. "This is an outrage. Vanguard contracted Apex in good faith. If the engineering firm made a clerical error in their drafting, that is a matter for their internal review. But it does not change the fact that... It changes the fact that you just committed felony fraud on the public record." "Mr. Vance," Commander Prentice said, stepping out from behind Darnell. Prentice walked up to the mahogany table, bypassing the public microphone entirely. She looked at Richard Vance, and then she looked at Calvin Pierce. "Filing a forged document to compel a municipal agency to execute a wrongful eviction is extortion." Prontis said, her voice dropping into the terrifyingly calm register of a predator closing its jaws. Using those forged documents to terrorize residents into signing away their lease rights for pennies on the dollar is racketeering. Prentice gestured toward the back doors of the chamber. 2 plainclothes detectives stepped into the room, their badges hanging from chains around their necks. Richard Vance. Calvin Pierce. Prontis said, "You are both under arrest for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. Detectives, take them." Vance staggered back from the podium as if he had been physically struck. "You can't do this! I am the CEO of Vanguard. I had no knowledge of the technical drafting. Pierce handled the ground acquisitions. Pierce hired Apex." Vance turned on Pierce with the vicious, desperate speed of a shark turning on its pilot fish. "He brought me the paperwork! He told me the block was secure!" Pierce's flawless composure shattered completely. The tailored suit suddenly looked like a cage. "You gave the order." "Richard, you told me to clear the block by any means necessary." Pierce backed away from the podium, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit. He took a step toward the side aisle. Darnell Crew stepped into the aisle, blocking it completely. He stood 6'3", a wall of dark blue wool and polished brass, immovable and absolute. He looked down at the man who had threatened his career, threatened his pension, and tried to bulldoze the lives of the people he had sworn to protect. "You're not leaving, Calvin," Darnell said quietly. Pierce looked at Darnell, his chest heaving, the slick corporate armor entirely gone, leaving only the panicked, small man underneath. "Crew, please. I was just doing the job. I was just playing the game." "You played the wrong block," Darnell said. The detectives moved in. The metallic times, snick-click times of the handcuffs locking around Calvin Pierce's wrists echoed sharply in the wood-paneled room. From her place beside the public microphone, Mrs. Margaret Elstrom rested both hands on her walker, watched Pierce being led away, and gave a single, satisfied nod. "The math," she murmured, "always balances." The aftermath of the hearing arrived not in a shout, but in a long, collective exhale that rolled down the 1400 block of Carver Street like a change in the weather. The neon orange Times, condemned Times stickers were peeled off the glass of Solomon's Hardware by the end of the week. Richard Vance was indicted, and Vanguard Holdings assets were frozen, pending a massive federal investigation into their acquisition tactics across the city. Calvin Pierce surrendered his law license and faced 5 to 10 years in a state facility. The specific and brutal consequence of a man who believed the rules did not apply to him until the moment the rules locked around his wrists. And on Carver Street, the ordinary rhythm of life resumed, louder and stronger than it had been before. Aaron, Solomon's nephew, officially took over the daily operations of the hardware store, bringing in new inventory and setting up a community bulletin board near the register. Cecile unpacked her cardboard boxes, her children returning to their cartoons, the terror of the shelter erased completely from their future. On a Thursday afternoon in early May, Darnell Crew walked into apartment 3B. The windows were open, letting in the warm breeze. Mrs. Elstrom was sitting at her desk, the file box open, writing a new entry in her precise, consistent hand. Loretta was in the kitchen, pouring tea, and, sitting at the kitchen table, her legs swinging beneath her, was Amara. She had her colored pencils spread out across the table. Darnell walked over to her. "What are you drawing today?" "Baby?" he asked. Amara looked up, her gap-toothed smile bright and entirely unbothered. She slid the piece of paper across the table toward him. It was not a drawing of a single police car anymore. It was a drawing of a street. There was a green building with window boxes, and a hardware store with a sign, and a park bench. And standing in a line across the bottom of the page, holding hands, were 5 figures. One was a tall man with a yellow badge. One was a small woman with white hair and a walker. One was a woman in a suit. One was an older woman with a teapot. And one was a man with a broom. And drawn above them, hovering in the sky like a protective canopy, were 3 sparrows: Ferdinand, Ferdinand, and Ferdinand. Darnell looked at the drawing. He looked at the wide crayon arms of the figures, all connected, stretching across the entire width of the page, keeping the whole street safe. He reached into his right jacket pocket. He pulled out the old, folded drawing, the one of just him, standing alone beside the car, and he looked at it. It was worn soft at the creases. It had done its job. It had reminded him who he was on the darkest nights. But it was no longer the whole truth. He folded the new drawing carefully, the one with the whole line of people, the one with the sparrows, and he slid it into his right jacket pocket, where it fit perfectly. "It's beautiful." "Amara," Darnell said softly. "It's exactly right. Let's walk back through this one last time. Because the parts of this story only matter if you look at how they connect. We started with a citation for rock salt. Ah, Petu. Bureaucratic piece of cruelty designed to make a proud man feel small. Executed by a sergeant who thought a uniform was just a tool for leverage. We moved to a neon orange sticker slapped on a glass door. A lie dressed up as math. A billionaire developer trying to steal the ground out from under people he had decided were too poor to fight back. We watched Calvin Pierce weaponize the municipal code, weaponize the midnight shift, weaponize the very system designed to protect the city, all to serve an empire of greed. And how was it defeated? It was not defeated by a superhero. It was defeated by the exact things Pierce had sneered at. It was defeated by 26 years of a retired teacher looking out her third-floor window and caring enough to write down what she saw. It was defeated by a student who remembered the woman who taught her how things broke down. It was defeated by a mother pouring tea and a family support worker walking up 2 flights of stairs, and an old man sweeping the sidewalk in front of his store. Calvin Pierce looked at the 1400 block of Carver Street and saw a block of ghosts, waiting to be cleared away. Darnell Crew looked at the exact same block and saw an intricate, living network of people who were already holding each other up. Pierce's cruelty was vast and well-funded, but it was brittle. It required everyone in its path to remain isolated, frightened, and quiet. But the moment the woman with the walker connected with the man with the badge, who connected with the woman at the infrastructure office, the isolation broke, the network fired, and the lie collapsed under the weight of people simply refusing to look away from each other. That is the true cost of Pierce's arrogance. He fundamentally misunderstood what strength actually looks like. He thought strength was a $50 million land assembly and an eviction notice. He didn't realize that true strength is a community that has spent decades paying attention. The cruelty cost him his freedom. The attention saved the block. This story is fiction. Vanguard Holdings is a shell company made of words. And Richard Vance is a ghost. And the emergency condemnation hearing in room 402 never happened. But you already know the true part. You know that right now. In your city. There is a developer looking at a neighborhood and seeing nothing but the dirt beneath it. You know there is a system that rubber stamps the eviction of the vulnerable because it is easier than fighting the wealthy. You know the exact shape of the fear that Cecile felt packing those cardboard boxes. Because that fear is manufactured every single day by people who believe that money grants them the right to erase whoever is inconvenient to their progress. But this story is also here to tell you that the defense against that erasure is not a mystery. It is not magic. It is simply paying attention. It is the box of notes. It is knowing your neighbors. It is extending your arm before you decide to, and showing up on Thursday afternoons, and refusing to let the people who run the machine tell you that what you see with your own eyes isn't real. The machine relies on your silence. The machine relies on your exhaustion. So let me ask you, when was the last time you stopped and really looked at the street you live on? When was the last time you asked the person sweeping the sidewalk how their day was? Or checked on the neighbor on the second floor? Or took notes on the things that are broken so you can be ready when the time comes to fix them? If this story moved you, share it with someone who is doing the quiet, unglamorous work of holding their own neighborhood together. Share it with the teachers, the beat cops, the hardware store owners, and the people sitting in the third floor windows. Tell them that their attention matters. Tell them that the box they are building is the only thing that eventually